Harvey sat in his dressing room staring at the mirror. The bright lights overhead cast a warm glow on his face, but they couldn't hide the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. It had been a long week, longer than usual, but tonight was special. Tonight's episode promised to be different, maybe even memorable. He adjusted his tie for the third time, smoothing out imaginary wrinkles as he tried to calm the flutter in his chest. Something about tonight felt off. The theme for the evening was Voices from Beyond. It wasn't a new concept. Talk shows often dabbled in stories of loss and connection, especially during Sweeps Week when ratings mattered most. Steve knew how to handle these segments. He always did. A little humor here, a heartfelt moment there, and voila, television gold. But this time something nagged at him. Maybe it was the way Lisa Monroe, his producer, had acted earlier when she handed him the guest list. She'd seemed unusually quiet, almost hesitant, like she was holding back. Just another day at the office, Steve muttered to himself, forcing a smile. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's show would test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Out in the studio, the audience buzzed with excitement. People chatted animatedly, their voices blending into a cheerful hum. Cameras were positioned strategically, capturing every angle of the brightly lit set. Backstage crew members scurried around, making last-minute adjustments to microphones and lighting rigs. Everything seemed normal, yet Steve's unease lingered. He glanced at the rundown sheet one more time. The first two guests were typical, a chef promoting her new cookbook and a magician performing tricks, but it was the third guest who caught his attention again. Her name was Karoline Leavitt, and her story was marked simply as Emotional Message from Beyond. That vague description didn't sit well with Steve. He preferred details, concrete facts he could work with. Without them, he felt unprepared, exposed. Lisa appeared beside him, clipboard in hand. "You ready?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "As ready as I'll ever be," Steve replied with a shrug. "What's the deal with Karoline? You're acting like she's carrying some kind of bombshell." Lisa hesitated, chewing her lip before responding. "She's complicated. Just trust me on this one, okay? Let her do the talking, and whatever you do, don't interrupt her." Steve raised an eyebrow. "That bad?" "No, not bad," Lisa said quickly. "Just intense. Trust me, you'll understand once you meet her." Before Steve could press further, the stage manager signaled that it was time to go live. Taking a deep breath, Steve plastered on his signature grin and walked onto the set. The applause erupted instantly, loud and enthusiastic, washing over him like a wave. This was his element, his domain. For a brief moment, the tension melted away, replaced by the familiar rush of adrenaline. "Good evening, everybody," Steve boomed, waving to the audience. "How are we doing tonight?" The crowd cheered even louder, feeding off his energy. Steve launched into his opening monologue, cracking jokes about current events and poking fun at himself. By the time he introduced the first guest, the atmosphere was electric. The chef charmed everyone with her quirky personality, and the magician dazzled the audience with sleight-of-hand tricks. Steve played his part perfectly, keeping the mood light and engaging. But as the second segment drew to a close, Steve's nerves returned. He glanced at the teleprompter, where Karoline's name now loomed large. Beside him, Lisa gave a subtle nod, her expression unreadable. Steve swallowed hard and turned toward the entrance. "And now," he said, his voice steady, despite the knot in his stomach, "we have someone very special joining us tonight. Please welcome Karoline Leavitt." The audience clapped politely as Karoline stepped onto the stage. She looked younger than Steve had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and a simple dress that matched her understated demeanor. Yet there was something commanding about her presence, a quiet intensity that made Steve sit up straighter. Karoline took her seat across from him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Up close, Steve noticed the faint redness around her eyes, as if she'd been crying recently. He leaned forward slightly, offering her a reassuring smile. "Welcome to the show, Karoline," he began. "Thank you for being here." "Thank you for having me," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Steve nodded, sensing that this wouldn't be an easy conversation. So, tell us a little bit about yourself. What brings you here tonight? Karoline hesitated, glancing down at her hands before meeting his gaze. I'm here because I need to share something important, something that's been weighing on me for a long time. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Steve felt the shift immediately. The playful banter and lightheartedness of earlier segments evaporated, replaced by an almost tangible sense of anticipation. The audience grew still, leaning forward in their seats. Well, Steve said slowly, choosing his words carefully, you've certainly got our attention. Why don't you start from the beginning? Karoline took a deep breath, steadying herself. It's about my father, she began. His name was Richard. He passed away 2 years ago in a car accident. A murmur rippled through the audience, followed by sympathetic sighs. Steve nodded sympathetically, encouraging her to continue. At first I thought I'd never hear from him again, Karoline continued. But then, things started happening. Strange things. Steve tilted his head, intrigued. Like what? Karoline hesitated again, as if unsure how much to reveal. Finally, she said, I started receiving emails from him. The room fell silent. Even the crew members froze, their movements halted mid-task. Steve blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Emails from the dead? It sounded like the plot of a sci-fi movie, not real life. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, realizing this wasn't the time for jokes. These emails, he ventured cautiously. Are you saying they're really from your father? Karoline nodded, her expression solemn. Yes, at least I believe so. They contained information only he could know, things no one else would have access to. Steve felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to dismiss it as coincidence or some elaborate hoax, but there was something genuine in Karoline's eyes, a raw vulnerability that made him pause. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a story for ratings. This was real. I see, Steve said finally, his voice softer now. And tonight you're going to share one of these messages with us? Yes, Karoline replied, but not just any message. This one, it's addressed to you, Mr. Harvey. The words hit Steve like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what she'd just said. Addressed to him? How could that be possible? He forced himself to maintain his composure, though. His heart was pounding in his chest. To me? He echoed, his voice barely audible. Karoline nodded. Yes, and I think you need to hear it. For the first time in his career, Steve found himself at a loss for words. The audience watched in stunned silence, their collective breath held as they waited to see what would happen next. Steve glanced at Lisa, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. Whatever doubts he had, whatever fears gnawed at him, he knew he couldn't back out now. Okay, he said finally, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside him. Let's hear it. Karoline reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. As she unfolded it, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Steve braced himself, unsure of what to expect, but certain that nothing would ever be the same again. Karoline held the piece of paper tightly in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded it. The studio lights caught the edges of the paper, making it glow faintly under the bright glare. Steve watched her intently, his mind racing with questions but his expression calm and composed. He had spent years mastering the art of keeping his emotions in check on live television, but tonight felt different. Something about Karoline's presence, and the weight of what she was about to share, made him feel exposed, like the world could see through his usual charm and wit. The audience remained silent, their earlier excitement replaced by a palpable tension. Even the crew members seemed frozen in place, their eyes glued to Karoline as if they were afraid to miss a single word. Steve glanced at Lisa Monroe, who stood off stage with her arms crossed. Her face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of concern in her eyes that made Steve even more uneasy. This message, Karoline began softly, her voice barely above a whisper, is from my father. I've read it many times, but every time I do, it feels like he's speaking directly to me, like he's still here. Steve nodded slowly, encouraging her to continue. Take your time, he said gently. His words were meant to comfort her, but they also gave him a moment to steady himself. Whatever was coming, he knew it would be powerful. Karoline took a deep breath and began to read. Her voice grew stronger as she went on, though it still carried an underlying sadness that tugged at the hearts of everyone listening. Dear Karoline, she read, her voice wavering slightly. If you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you. I don't know how these words are reaching you. I don't understand it myself, but I need you to know that I'm okay. Wherever I am, I'm at peace. She paused for a moment, lowering the paper as tears welled up in her eyes. Steve leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowed with concern. It's okay, he said softly. You can take your time. Karoline nodded and wiped her eyes before continuing. I want you to forgive yourself for our last argument. You didn't mean what you said, and neither did I. I know you've been carrying that guilt, but you shouldn't. Life is too short for regrets. The audience let out a collective sigh, some people nodding along while others dabbed at their eyes with tissues. Steve felt a lump form in his throat. He had heard countless stories of loss and redemption over the years, but this one struck a chord deep within him. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the raw honesty behind them, the kind that couldn't be faked or scripted. Karoline took another shaky breath and kept reading. Live fully, my sweet girl. Don't let fear hold you back. Do the things that make you happy, even if they scare you. And most importantly, never forget how much I love you. By now, tears were streaming down Karoline's face, but she didn't stop. She pressed on, her voice breaking as she reached the final lines. There's someone else I need to speak to now, someone who might not expect to hear from me. Mr. Harvey, if you're listening, I want to thank you. Steve froze. His heart skipped a beat as Karoline's eyes met his. The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the gravity of the moment. For a split second, Steve wondered if he had misheard her. But the look on Karoline's face confirmed it. This part of the message was truly meant for him. I watched your show during my final days, she continued, her voice faltering. Your words about family and resilience helped me find peace when I needed it most. But I also have a warning for you. Don't lose sight of what truly matters. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the hum of the studio lights seemed to fade into the background. Steve stared at Karoline, his mind reeling. What did this mean? Was it a coincidence? Or was there something deeper at play? He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. Instead, he found himself leaning back in his chair, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions he hadn't anticipated. Memories of his own father flashed through his mind, unbidden and unwelcome. Their strained relationship, the arguments they'd had, the apologies left unsaid, all of it came rushing back in an instant. Karoline folded the paper carefully and placed it back in her bag. She looked at Steve with a mixture of sympathy and determination. That's all of it, she said quietly. I know it's a lot to process, but I felt like you needed to hear it. Steve nodded slowly, still trying to gather his thoughts. Thank you, he managed to say, his voice hoarse. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, Karoline replied. Just listen, that's all I ask. The audience erupted into applause, breaking the spell that had fallen over the room. People clapped and cheered, moved by the emotional exchange they had just witnessed. Some even stood up, giving Karoline a standing ovation. But Steve barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, lost in a whirlwind of memories and unanswered questions as The applause died down. Steve forced himself to focus. He cleared his throat and turned to Karoline, offering her a small, grateful smile. That was incredible, he said finally. Thank you for sharing that with us. With me. Karoline nodded, her expression softening. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had to do it. For him. And maybe for you too. Steve felt a pang of guilt. He wasn't used to being vulnerable on camera, especially not in front of millions of viewers. But tonight he couldn't hide behind jokes or clever remarks. He owed it to Karoline and to himself, to be honest. "I lost my father years ago," he admitted, surprising even himself with the admission. "We weren't close, and I've spent a lot of time regretting that. Hearing your story, it makes me think about things I haven't thought about in a long time." The audience murmured in agreement, their faces filled with empathy. Steve rarely talked about his personal life, so this revelation hit them hard. They could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of years' worth of unresolved emotions. Karoline reached out and placed a hand on Steve's arm. "Maybe it's not too late," she said gently. "Maybe there's still a way to heal even if they're not here anymore." Steve nodded, blinking back tears. He wanted to believe her, but the doubts lingered. Could he really let go of the guilt and anger he'd carried for so long? And what did Richard Leavitt's message mean? This warning to not lose sight of what truly matters. It felt like a puzzle piece missing from a larger picture, one that Steve wasn't sure he was ready to solve. Lisa appeared beside them, signaling that it was time to wrap up the segment. Steve took a deep breath and turned back to the audience, forcing a smile. "Well, folks," he said, his voice steadier now, "that was something we won't soon forget. Thank you, Karoline, for being brave enough to share your story with us." The audience applauded again, their cheers echoing through the studio. Karoline stood up and hugged Steve briefly before stepping off the stage. As she disappeared behind the curtain, Steve sat there, staring at the empty chair she had occupied moments before. When the cameras cut to commercial, Steve retreated backstage, his mind still spinning. Lisa approached him cautiously, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone softer than usual. "I don't know," Steve admitted, running a hand over his face. "That was intense." Lisa nodded sympathetically. "I told you she was special." "You weren't kidding," Steve muttered. He glanced at the monitor, where clips of the segment were already being replayed for viewers at home. Seeing himself on screen, looking so vulnerable, made him uncomfortable. But there was something else too. A spark of curiosity, a desire to understand what had just happened. "Do you believe her?" Steve asked suddenly, turning to Lisa. "About the emails, I mean." Lisa hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know what to believe, but I do know this. Whatever it is, it's real to her. And maybe that's enough." Steve nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. Whether or not the emails were genuine didn't matter as much as the impact they had on Karoline and on him. For the first time in years, he felt a crack in the wall he had built around his emotions, a crack that might, just maybe, let some light in. As the next segment began, Steve returned to his seat, his usual charm masking the storm of thoughts swirling inside him. But deep down, he knew that tonight's show had changed something. Something big. And he wasn't sure he was ready for what came next. After the show ended, Steve lingered in his dressing room longer than usual. The adrenaline that had carried him through the live broadcast had faded, leaving behind a restless energy he couldn't shake. He sat at the small table, staring at the mirror but not really seeing his reflection. His mind kept circling back to Karoline's words, the message from her father, the warning meant for him. It felt like a puzzle he couldn't solve no matter how hard he tried. Lisa knocked gently on the door before stepping inside. She held a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. "Thought you might need this," she said, setting the coffee down in front of him. Steve glanced at the steaming cup but didn't touch it. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice distant. "You okay?" Lisa asked, pulling up a chair beside him. Her tone was casual, but her eyes betrayed her concern. "I don't know," Steve admitted after a moment. "That whole thing with Karoline, it got under my skin." Lisa nodded as if she'd expected this reaction. "It got under everyone's skin. You saw the audience. They were hooked. People don't forget moments like that." "It's not just about the audience," Steve said, shaking his head. "It's personal. That message, it felt like it was speaking directly to me. Like it knew something I didn't." Lisa hesitated, unsure how to respond. She opened the folder she'd brought with her and slid a few papers across the table. I did some digging while you were wrapping up. Thought you might want to see this. Steve picked up the papers and scanned them. Quickly. They contained basic information about Richard Leavitt, his military service, his career as a mechanic, even details about his family. But one line caught Steve's attention, served alongside Daniel Harvey, deceased. Steve's breath hitched. He looked up at Lisa, his expression unreadable. Daniel? My brother? Lisa nodded slowly. Yeah, looks like they were in the same unit back in the day. Didn't you say your brother died overseas? Steve's hands tightened around the papers. Yeah, he did. But they told us it was an accident, a roadside bomb. No one ever mentioned anything about connections or classified stuff. Lisa shrugged. Maybe there's more to it. Or maybe it's just a coincidence. Steve shook his head, his jaw clenched. I don't believe in coincidences anymore. The weight of the situation settled over him like a heavy blanket. For years he had avoided thinking about Daniel, burying the pain of his loss beneath layers of work and laughter. But now, with Karoline's story stirring old memories and new questions, he couldn't ignore it any longer. Later that night, Steve found himself sitting alone in his living room, the city lights casting shadows on the walls. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. After a few rings, a sleepy voice answered. Hello. Hey, Mom, Steve said, his voice quieter than usual. Sorry to wake you. There was a pause on the other end. Steve, is everything all right? Yeah, I just needed to ask you something. About Dad and Daniel. The line went silent for a moment. When his mother spoke again, her voice was tinged with sadness. What do you want to know? Steve hesitated, unsure where to start. Do you remember when Daniel died? Did they ever tell you exactly what happened? His mother sighed deeply. They said it was an accident, a roadside bomb like we all thought. Why are you asking about this now? Steve leaned back against the couch, rubbing his temples. Something came up tonight at the show. A guest talked about losing her father, and it made me think about Daniel. And then I found out her dad served with him. That's strange, his mother said softly. But Steve, sweetheart, why are you digging into this? It's been so long. I don't know, Steve admitted. It's like, I feel like there's something I'm missing. Something important. His mother was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. Your father blamed himself, you know, after Daniel died. He thought he should have done more to protect him, even though there wasn't anything he could have done. That guilt ate away at him until the day he passed. Steve closed his eyes, the words hitting him harder than he expected. He had always known his father carried guilt, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way he hadn't anticipated. Mom, he said finally, do you think Dad ever tried to reach out to anyone from Daniel's unit to find answers? I'm not sure, his mother replied, but if he did, he never told me about it. Steve thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. He realized that his father's silence hadn't been about indifference. It had been about pain. Pain that Steve had misinterpreted as coldness for most of his life. Now, faced with the possibility that Daniel's death might not have been as straightforward as they'd been told, Steve felt a mix of anger and determination bubbling inside him. The next morning, Steve reached out to Karoline. She agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe downtown, bringing with her a stack of documents and emails she had saved over the years. As they sat together at a corner table, Karoline explained how she had pieced together fragments of her father's final days. He used to talk about experiments, Karoline said, flipping through a notebook filled with scribbled notes. Things he wasn't supposed to talk about. I didn't understand it at the time, but looking back, I think he was involved in something bigger than he let on. What kind of experiments? Steve asked, leaning forward. Karoline shrugged. I'm not sure. Something about communication technology. He mentioned satellites and signals once, but he changed the subject whenever I asked too many questions. Steve frowned, piecing together the implications. If Richard Leavitt had been part of some secretive project, it could explain the mysterious emails, and perhaps even Daniel's death, but proving any of it would be nearly impossible. "We need to dig deeper," Steve said firmly. "If there's a connection between your dad and my brother, I want to know what it is." Karoline nodded, her expression resolute. "Whatever it takes." Over the next few days, Steve and Karoline worked tirelessly, combing through old records, reaching out to former soldiers who had served with Richard and Daniel, and following every lead they could find. It wasn't easy. Many of the people they contacted were reluctant to talk, citing confidentiality agreements or fear of retaliation. But they persisted. One name kept coming up. A scientist named Dr. Alan Meyer, who had reportedly overseen several classified projects during the time Richard and Daniel were active. Tracking him down proved difficult. He seemed to have vanished after retiring from the military. But eventually, Steve managed to locate an address, an old cabin tucked away in the mountains. When they arrived, the air was crisp and cool, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. The cabin looked abandoned, its windows dark and dusty. Steve knocked on the door anyway, half expecting no one to answer. To their surprise, a frail man with silver hair opened the door, squinting at them through thick glasses. "Dr. Meyer?" Steve asked cautiously. The man nodded, his gaze wary. "Who are you?" "My name is Steve Harvey," Steve said, gesturing to Karoline. "This is Karoline Leavitt. We're trying to piece together some things about our families. Specifically, about Richard Leavitt and Daniel Harvey." Dr. Meyer's face paled slightly, but he stepped aside and motioned for them to come in. Inside, the cabin was cluttered with books and papers, the faint smell of mildew lingering in the air. As they sat down, Dr. Meyer poured 3 cups of tea, his hands trembling slightly. "What do you know?" Steve asked bluntly. Dr. Meyer hesitated, glancing between them. "Some things are better left buried," he said finally. "But if you're here, I suppose you already suspect the truth." Karoline leaned forward, her voice steady. "We just want to understand. Please." Dr. Meyer sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Your fathers, or rather your brother and Karoline's father, were part of a project designed to test experimental communication systems that could transmit messages across vast distances, even beyond, well, conventional limits." Steve's heart raced. "You mean like messages from the dead?" Dr. Meyer nodded slowly. "In theory, yes, the technology was flawed, unstable. There were risks involved, risks we didn't fully understand. Some men didn't make it home." Steve felt a chill run down his spine. "Was my brother one of them?" Dr. Meyer looked away, guilt etched into his weathered face. "I can't say for certain, but I will tell you this. Whatever happened to those men, it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't natural." The revelation hit Steve like a punch to the gut. He had spent years blaming himself for not being closer to Daniel, for not understanding their strained relationship. Now, faced with the possibility that Daniel's death had been part of something far darker, Steve felt a surge of anger and resolve. As they left the cabin, the sun dipping below the horizon, Karoline turned to Steve. "What do we do now?" Steve took a deep breath, his jaw set. "We tell the truth, all of it." Steve and Karoline spent the next few days piecing together everything they had learned. It wasn't easy. Dr. Meyer's revelations had opened a Pandora's box of questions, and every answer seemed to lead to 2 more. They sifted through old military records, declassified documents, and fragments of stories from other families who had lost loved ones under mysterious circumstances. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Richard Leavitt and Daniel Harvey weren't isolated cases. There were others, men and women whose deaths had been written off as accidents or classified as top-secret incidents. But what struck Steve most was how much of this pain had been hidden away. Families were left in the dark, grieving without closure, while the truth remained buried under layers of secrecy. He thought about his own family, his mother's quiet suffering, his father's guilt-ridden silence, and realized just how heavy those secrets could be. For years, he had tried to escape that weight by focusing on his career, cracking jokes and keeping things light. Now, he understood that running from the past only made it harder to face. Karoline noticed the change in him. "You're taking this pretty hard," she said one evening as they sat in Steve's office, surrounded by stacks of papers and open laptops. "It's not just about my brother anymore," Steve replied, leaning back in his chair. "It's about all of them, all the people who never got answers. Don't you think they deserve better?" Karoline nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I agree. But exposing something like this? It's risky. Are you ready for that?" Steve hesitated. He knew she was right. Going public with their findings would mean challenging powerful forces that didn't take kindly to having their secrets exposed. It could cost him his reputation, maybe even his career. But as he looked at the faces of the soldiers, in the photos spread across his desk, he felt a sense of responsibility he couldn't ignore. "I have to do it," he said finally. "If I don't, who will?" The decision to use his platform came naturally. Steve had spent decades building trust with his audience, using humor and heart to connect with millions of viewers. Now he would use that same platform to shine a light on the shadows. He called an emergency meeting with Lisa and the rest of his production team, laying out his plan. "We're dedicating the next 3 episodes to this story," Steve announced, pacing the room. "We'll talk about the experiments, the families affected, and the cover-ups. We'll give these people a voice." Lisa stared at him, her arms crossed. "Steve, you realize what you're stepping into, right? This isn't just some feel-good segment. People are going to push back. Hard." "I know," Steve said firmly. "But if we don't try, nothing changes. Isn't that why we do this job? To make a difference?" His words resonated with the team. Though some were hesitant, they agreed to move forward, knowing that Steve's instincts had rarely led them astray. Over the next week, they worked tirelessly, reaching out to families connected to the project, interviewing experts, and gathering evidence. Each new piece of information added depth to the story, painting a picture of systemic neglect and betrayal. When the first episode aired, the response was immediate. Viewers flooded social media with messages of support, sharing their own stories of loss and unanswered questions. Some even came forward with documents and testimonies, adding fuel to the growing movement. By the second episode, the show had become a national conversation, sparking debates in living rooms and newsrooms alike. On the final night of the series, Steve invited Karoline to join him on stage once again. This time, the atmosphere was electric, charged with emotion and anticipation. The audience erupted into applause as she walked out, her presence commanding respect. She carried a folder filled with letters and emails from families who had reached out after hearing their story. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Steve began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Over the past few weeks, we've shared stories of courage, resilience, and hope. Stories of men and women who gave everything, only to have their sacrifices swept under the rug. Tonight we're going to hear directly from those left behind. One by one, families took turns reading letters addressed to their lost loved ones. Some spoke of forgiveness, others of anger, but all carried a thread of love that united them. When it was Karoline's turn, she stepped up to the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. "This is for you, Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "I miss you every day. But because of you, and because of people like Steve, I'm learning to let go, to live fully just like you asked me to." The audience stood, applauding so loudly that the sound reverberated through the studio. Tears streamed down faces, both on stage and in the crowd. Even the crew members, usually stoic professionals, wiped their eyes discreetly. As the segment drew to a close, Steve turned to Karoline and offered her a heartfelt hug. Then, facing the audience, he spoke from the heart. "This journey has changed me in ways I never expected. It's reminded me of what truly matters. Not fame or success, but connection, love, truth. And if telling these stories helps even one person find peace, then it's worth it." The applause continued long after the cameras cut to commercial. Backstage, Lisa approached Steve, her usual no-nonsense demeanor softened by pride. "You did good, Steve," she said simply. Thanks, Steve replied, smiling despite the exhaustion etched on his face. But this isn't over. Not yet. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of the show became undeniable. Families formed support groups, pooling resources and information to demand accountability. Journalists picked up the story, publishing exposés that forced government officials to address the allegations. While full transparency remained elusive, cracks began to form in the walls of secrecy. For Steve, the experience marked a turning point. He returned to his hometown for the first time in years, visiting his brother's grave and placing flowers at the headstone. Standing there, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't known was possible. "I'm sorry, Danny," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have asked more questions. Should have been there for you, but I promise I won't forget you. None of us will." Back in the city, Karoline thanked Steve for helping her heal. "You didn't just give me a voice," she said. "You gave me hope." Steve smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Hope goes both ways, Karoline. You gave me mine back." As the season finale aired, Steve reflected on the road ahead. The fight for justice wouldn't be easy, but he knew he wasn't alone. Together, they had uncovered a truth too important to ignore, and in doing so, they had found redemption in the most unexpected places. The weeks that followed the airing of Steve's groundbreaking series were unlike anything he had ever experienced. The response from viewers was overwhelming. Emails, letters, and phone calls poured in, each one carrying its own story of loss, longing, or gratitude. Some thanked him for giving a voice to those who had been silenced. Others shared their own suspicions about loved ones lost under mysterious circumstances. It was clear that Steve's decision to dive into the truth had struck a chord with people across the country. But it wasn't just the public reaction that caught Steve off guard. It was the personal impact it had on him. For years, he had kept his emotions locked away, hiding behind jokes and charm as a way to cope with the pain of losing his brother Daniel. Now he found himself confronting those feelings head-on, no longer able to ignore the weight of unresolved grief. Every story he heard, every tear shed by a family member on his show, reminded him of his own journey. He realized that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering, honoring, and finding meaning in the pain. One morning, as Steve sat alone in his kitchen sipping coffee, he picked up an old photo album his mother had sent him. Inside were pictures of his childhood, smiling faces frozen in time, moments captured before life became complicated. There was a photo of him and Daniel playing catch in the backyard, another of their father teaching them how to fix a car. Looking at those images, Steve felt a mix of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for what had been lost, but gratitude for the memories that remained. That afternoon he called his mother. Their conversations over the years had often been strained, marked by unspoken regrets and missed opportunities. But this time, when her voice came through the line, it was warm and welcoming. "Hi, Mom," Steve said, his tone softer than usual. "How are you?" "I'm doing okay, sweetheart," she replied. "What about you? How are you holding up after everything?" Steve hesitated, unsure where to begin. "I've been thinking a lot about Dad and Daniel, about all the things we never talked about." His mother sighed deeply, her voice tinged with emotion. "Me too. I think about them every day." For the first time in years, they spoke openly about the past, their fears, their guilt, their love for the men they had lost. Steve learned things about his father he'd never known, like how proud he had been of Steve's success even if he didn't always know how to express it. They cried together, laughed together, and promised to visit soon. When they finally hung up, Steve felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in decades. Meanwhile, Karoline continued to play a vital role in Steve's life. Their partnership had started as a shared mission to uncover the truth, but it had grown into something deeper, a friendship built on mutual understanding and trust. Together, they organized community events for families affected by similar losses, creating spaces where people could share their stories without fear of judgment. These gatherings weren't just about mourning. They were about celebrating lives cut short, finding strength in unity and pushing for change. At one such event, held in a small auditorium in downtown Chicago, Steve stood beside Karoline as she addressed the crowd. Her voice was strong yet gentle, filled with compassion and resolve. "We're not here to dwell on the pain," she said, looking out at the sea of faces. "We're here to honor the ones we've lost, and to remind ourselves that we're not alone. Together we can fight for justice and for peace." The audience erupted into applause, many standing to cheer. Steve watched proudly as Karoline stepped back, her eyes shining with tears. He leaned over and whispered, "You're amazing, you know that?" She smiled, shaking her head slightly. "We're amazing. None of this would have happened without you." As the evening drew to a close, Steve took the stage for a few closing remarks. He looked out at the crowd, seeing faces young and old, some smiling, others visibly struggling to hold back tears. Each person carried their own burden, their own story, but tonight, they were united. "When I started this journey," Steve began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I thought I was searching for answers, truths hidden in shadows. But what I found instead was something far greater. Connection, love, hope. Those may sound like simple words, but they're powerful. They remind us that even in our darkest moments, we're never truly alone." He paused, glancing at Karoline before continuing. "There's still so much work to do, so many questions left unanswered. But if we keep standing together, if we keep fighting for what's right, I believe we can make a difference, not just for ourselves, but for future generations." The room erupted into applause once again, the energy palpable. As Steve stepped down from the stage, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known was possible. This wasn't just about exposing secrets or seeking justice. It was about creating a legacy of hope and resilience. In the months that followed, Steve used his platform to amplify the voices of those fighting for transparency. He launched a foundation dedicated to supporting families affected by classified military projects, providing resources for legal assistance, counseling, and advocacy. The initiative gained widespread support, attracting donations and volunteers from all walks of life. Karoline became a key figure in the foundation, traveling across the country to meet with families and advocate for policy changes. She and Steve remained close, their bond strengthened by the shared purpose that had brought them together. Though neither knew exactly where the road ahead would lead, they were committed to walking it side by side. One crisp autumn evening, as Steve prepared for another episode of his show, he reflected on how far he had come. The man staring back at him in the mirror was different from the one who had nervously introduced Karoline Leavitt to millions of viewers months earlier. He was still the same charismatic host, but now he carried a depth and authenticity that resonated with audiences more than ever before. As the cameras rolled and the audience cheered, Steve greeted them with his trademark smile. "Good evening, everybody," he said warmly. "Tonight we're going to talk about something incredibly important, the power of truth. Because sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that set us free." The theme of the night was redemption, a topic Steve knew intimately. Guest speakers included whistleblowers, activists, and ordinary people who had faced unimaginable challenges but emerged stronger because they refused to give up. By the end of the show, the audience was on their feet, moved by the stories of courage and resilience. Backstage after the taping, Lisa approached Steve with a proud smile. "You really nailed it tonight," she said. "People are going to remember this one." Steve nodded, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. "Thanks, Lisa. But honestly, it's not about me. It's about them, the people brave enough to tell their stories. If I can help amplify their voices, then I've done my job." Lisa placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than your job, Steve. You've made a difference." As Steve packed up his things and headed home, he couldn't help but think about the journey ahead. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt, but there would also be triumphs, connections, and moments of grace. Whatever came next, he knew he wouldn't face it alone. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Steve, allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about his brother Daniel, his father, and all the others whose lives had been touched by the secrets they had uncovered. He thought about Karoline, whose courage had inspired him to dig deeper than he ever imagined possible, and he thought about the countless strangers who had reached out to thank him for giving them hope. Closing his eyes, Steve whispered a silent promise, to himself, to his family, and to everyone counting on him. "We'll keep going," he murmured. "No matter what." And with that, he drifted off to sleep, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring.